Welcome everyone to this webinar online event on reforming business environment in fragile and conflict affected situations. We really warmly welcome everyone. I hope you are all doing well. And this online event is hosted by the ICR Facility, who is co-founded by the European Union and the Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States. And this webinar is actually interpreted or translated simultaneously into French. So if you're here in the session now and you're hearing me speaking English, but you would like to listen in French, you can go to the online event in French, and please use the link that we are now sharing in the GoToWebinar chat box to go to then MS Teams, and you can listen into the French session. Then I would like to share some technical information with you before we start as well. This online event will be recorded. This is just for your information. And if you have questions throughout the session, please use the question box and type them there. We will have a lot of time in the end reserved to pick up your questions and ask the speakers. And if you are now participating in the French session and you have a question there, please write them in the chat box in MS Teams. You can write them in French, and our colleagues will forward them to us to ask the speakers. And then if you have any technical problems and you cannot find the chat box in the French session, then please write your questions to the email address provided to you, which is icrfacility@giz.de. And maybe just to introduce myself, because I haven't done that yet. My name is Janna. I work as an advisor for GIZ, and I will be the moderator of today's session. I'm very, very happy to have you all here, my speakers with me, and I'm going to introduce them to you in a second. But first, I would like to share with you the objectives of today's webinar. So, first of all, we would like to identify the key challenges and best practices in supporting business environment reforms in fragile and conflict-affected states, and as well learn from experience on the ground. This is why we have our speakers here today, who can kind of share experience from both sides. Also, I would like to share the agenda from today. We're now in the opening situation. I will introduce the speakers, then we will have a welcome, which is not being provided by Stephanie Kahn, project manager of the ICR Facility, but by my colleague Susanne Reichenbach, who will introduce the ICR Facility to you. Then we will have an input by Simon White on supporting business environment reforms in fragile and conflict-affected situations. And then we will have a panel discussion with our guests, Maisara Dandamun-Latiph and Rima das Pradhan-Blach. And I'm hoping I'm pronouncing your names somewhat right. Then we will have a Q&A session. And you are, as I said, feel free to post your questions throughout the session and we will pick them up then. And then we'll have a summary, a wrap up, and you will have in the end a satisfactory question which we would like you to ask you to answer as well, which is helpful for us. So I hope I have not missed anything, because then I'm turning to our speakers and I hope you can see them all also as they have turned on their cameras, and I will just quickly introduce them. This is Simon White, and he's an independent policy advisor who helps national, regional and city governments, business organizations and development agencies to formulate and implement strategies for economic growth, business development and job creation. He has provided these services to over 40 countries across Africa, Asia and the Pacific, as well as Australia and Europe. And I had the pleasure to work with Simon as well, which I really enjoyed, and I'm happy to have you here, Simon, for today's input. Then we have, oh, I'm sorry, Going back. Then we have Maisara Dandamun-Latiph. She is a member of the parliament in the Philippines currently. Is presently a legislator at the Bangsamoro Parliament in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in the Philippines. She's the technical working group chair for the British Council CSO seat, Social Enterprise Policy Technical Working Group, that champions social enterprises in Bangsamoro region. And currently, the policy has been adopted in the organic law of Bangsamoro as well as administrative code of Bangsamoro. So she will talk about exactly that also later. And I'm really happy to welcome you here, Maisara, to have you on the panel later. Also, I would like to introduce Rima das Pradhan-Blach. This is something very difficult for my tongue. She's currently the team leader for the European Union's Territorial Integration and Planning Facility for the Inclusive Local and Economic Development Program in Somalia. She will talk about that as well. She has worked in Somalia and Somaliland for the last 8 years, established large infrastructure projects, as well as an award-winning renewable energy 23 million project in Somalia. She has 25 years of experience work in fragile and conflict-affected countries such as Timor-Leste, Afghanistan, Nepal, Iraq, and Somalia. And she brings, as well as you can see, much experience on to the table, and we will hear from her experience in Somalia later on. And so I'm handing over to Susanne, who will introduce to us the ICR facility and its support functions. Over to you.
Thank you, Janna. Welcome everyone for joining our webinar today. My name is Susanne Reichenbach and I work at the Investment Climate Reform Facility, and I will quickly present it to you. So the ICR facility, which is short for Investment Climate Reform Facility, was kicked off in 2019, at the end of 2019, and we have started implementing at the end of this summer. It is a program which is co-funded by the European Union, by the Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States, by the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development and the British Council. And it is implemented by 4 different European agencies, GIZ, the British Council, Expertise France and SNB. What is our aim? We support public and private stakeholders in African, Caribbean and Pacific countries when they are conducting a public-private dialogue for implementing business environment reforms, which have the aim to improve the investment climate for businesses in their country or region. And our main field of work is that we provide demand-based support, which can be technical assistance only. So we do not provide funds, but we provide trainings, we can do analysis, we can also support you with the facilitation of strategy processes, but it is technical assistance only. And to give you some examples on some interventions that we've done so far, we recently started supporting the Ministry of Labour in Ghana in implementing their Green Job Strategy. We will be supporting soon an eco-industrial park in improving its framework conditions for more environmentally friendly businesses. And we will also be supporting business membership organizations in their strategies and in their work with the public sector. And as I mentioned, our support is demand-based, so you can hand in a request if you want to get support. And how do you do this? You can go to our website, www.icrfacility.eu, and check your eligibility criteria there and send us a request via an online form. And after an approval process on your eligibility and on your request, we can provide you support of maximum 90 expert days. And if you have questions or if you want more information, you can of course also write us an email. You can see the email address on the slide. And if you want to get more updates on our work or on further online events that we organize, because we organize them quite regularly, you can follow us on LinkedIn. We opened our LinkedIn page yesterday, so if you follow us, you would be amongst our first followers. So this is all on our general support, where we cover a wide range of topics. But besides to this, we also have another type of support. If you have specific questions on business environment reform amid conflict and fragility, which are specific on this webinar, we are also happy to provide you on a short-term basis with one-on-one sessions to work with Simon directly for a certain amount of days or hours. And I will explain these one-on-one sessions more in detail at the end of the webinar, but just to announce it also here. Yeah, that's everything from my side. I'm looking forward to the webinar and talk to you later.
Thank you, Susanne. Thank you for this information. As Susanne just said, we will come back to this later and you get some more information on the one-on-one sessions. And now turning to our today's topic, just supporting business environment reforms in fragile and conflict-affected situations. And we have our expert Simon White here, as I introduced before. And Simon has worked on this topic for some time already and will give us an overview of the topic. Over to you, Simon.
Thanks, Janna, and hello everyone. I hope you're all well and presumably in various states of lockdown. Maisara and I are in very different countries, but we share the same time zone tonight. She's in the Philippines area and I'm in Australia, on the west coast at least, and so it's a bit late here, but it's good to be connected to everybody. Thanks to the ICRF for the opportunity to participate in this webinar, and it's great to know that it's there as a resource to be able to provide support to various countries in the ACP that are doing reforms in this area. And I'm sure there's lots that can be picked up and taken on. And it's great to be able to talk about this work in terms of conflict-affected, fragile and conflict-affected situations, because I think it's particularly in places like this, which are difficult at times to work in, that it's important to give attention. So I have to ask you, Janna, if you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So I want to use a few minutes to present some highlights of a research that I was involved with, and the links to the document shown in the slide can be given. It was a research project that the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development organized, which does a lot of work in business environment reform, in particular produced donor guidelines in 2008 on what is a business environment and how to approach that. And from time to time they do different topics in this, and the issue of fragile and conflict-affected situations has come up. It was also supported by the ICRF, of course, and GIZ, which has been very valuable. It was a research project which really looked at a review of literature, a review of program documents from quite a number of countries, and then was involved in interviews with people who are practitioners who are working in the area of supporting and engaged with business environment reform in fragile and conflict areas, either as governments in these countries or as business representative organizations or as support agencies such as donor and development agencies. So the focus with this was really around what is the relevance of business environment reform in these situations. In some cases, we often see that there are arguments put that it might be too early to start talking about business, it might be too early to start talking about economic development, and possibly too early to start talking about business environment reform. So when is the right time? What are the priorities? And how should we think about configuring this work in such situations? For agencies that are working in these countries, they often talk about linking the development work with humanitarian assistance and trying to build those synergies up together. And it's within that framework that we're trying to think about where does business fit in, where does private sector development fit in, and reform. So I want to talk a little bit about that framing, and then I want to talk about some of the questions that we asked, and then I want to talk about just some of the highlights and advice, if you like, that came from that. Thanks, Janna. Okay, good, works. So firstly, I think we wanted to talk about recognizing that business has a role to play. On the positive side, we see that the private sector really does have the opportunity, the potential to create stability and peace and social cohesion. It can be a force for good. It can really drive growth and drive confidence and drive jobs and these kind of things. But of course, we also know that there are situations where the incumbent business sector, the existing private sector, can also contribute to violence and fragility. So we're not trying to paint a glossy picture here which says business development is always good, but we're trying to say that we recognize that there are different sides to this, and we need to be looking at introducing reforms that do bring about peace and stability and more cohesion. And what does that look like? What's interesting is when we've looked at the programs that are supporting private sector development in these situations, we often see that there's not a lot of attention is given to the interface between the two. So programming is generally seen, private sector development rather, is generally seen from an economic point of view. It's not always connected to the stabilization agenda. So when we're looking and evaluating private sector development programs, it's not always about has it created cohesion, has it created stability. It's much more about the economic metrics. So what we are seeing though is when we do start to look at the connection between the two, sometimes the indicators, sometimes the links are harder to find than we might first imagine. So I want to explore that a little bit further as we go on. Thanks, Janna. So one of the first questions we looked at is, what are the minimal requirements before you can start to do business environment reform in these situations? And what was interesting that I think came up in some of these discussions was that there is a difference between working on conflict and working in conflict. So working in conflict is really about the physical space. Is it safe to work in these areas? Are you able to engage and talk meaningfully with government? Can you engage the business community? Can you go beyond the usual business community and talk to people more broadly? Do you have to talk to armed groups? Do you have to talk to warlords? Or do you have to talk with insurgents in any way in doing this work? So working in conflict has a whole set of parameters that affects how people do their programming. But then, as I said in the earlier point, often what we're trying to focus on is what does it mean to work when you're working on conflict? That is, how can you do reforms and programming and engage with actors in ways that reduces conflict and enhances stabilization efforts and so on. So here we see that there is a process of what we could call the virtuous cycle, which is that positive side of working, helping with private sector development and working on the business development agenda. And here we're saying, if we can get this going early on in the piece, early on in the process, then we do start to create some results, what some people might call a peace dividend in terms of these outcomes. So by focusing on this, we are seeing that we contribute to better businesses, which is more incomes and more jobs. And of course, some people would say that every conflict has a root, has an economic root, and that in a sense, we can't always wait to talk about the economics or deal with economic issues later or deal with business issues later. They often have to be dealt with quite early in the piece, as early as possible. So really what we're saying is, this is not something that needs to be postponed as such. Where it is safe to do this work and where we can connect it to the work on conflict, it becomes very important. Thanks, Janna. So here we talk about then, what's the right sequencing? What should we think about when it comes to the sequencing of reforms? And this is essentially about prioritizing. What should come first? What should come second? Where does the priority lies? And of course, I should say in all of this, we're not presenting any blueprint for saying this applies the same in every single situation, but it really is a kind of way of thinking about this. So the first thing that I think we'd say about this is that we've learned that it's important to focus on the immediate needs of private investors. And of course, when I say private investors, I'm talking about domestic business people, people who are doing business on the ground, as well as other forms of domestic private investors, as well as foreign direct investment. But we're really talking about that whole range. And what we are really saying here is it is important to be as pragmatic as possible and looking for the opportunities to be working with those business people wherever possible. We know that there are instruments for business environment reform, such as the World Bank's Doing Business indicators. These are broad, fairly macro, 10 indicators generally to look at a business environment. Most people have said they're not really relevant to these situations. Instead, we're looking at much more pragmatic needs that might be affecting issues like access to finance, access to cheap, affordable, consistent energy, access to banks, dealing with police harassment. These kind of things might be some examples of the very pragmatic issues. The other issues that come up a lot is the focus on deals-based reforms. And there's a lot of new literature and programs around this. By this, we're talking about where there might be strategic investments. A strategic investment might be in energy, or it might be in telecoms, or it also might be in certain clusters of markets, in certain areas where there are people who are investing, and where if those opportunities are unleashed, there would be real benefit. So again, the focus here is not on the national reform overall. It's about saying we need to be more strategic in how we're focusing our reforms to deal with the practical problems that business people are facing. The other aspect about this is you can't just do a desktop or an abstract assessment. Public-private dialogue underpins a lot of this work. This is essentially, of course, where business and the government sit together and talk about the practical issues that affect them. Public-private dialogue is different to advocacy. It's about setting a shared agenda and coming up to it with an agreed set of priorities and moving forward. It's seen if that is done regularly and consistently and with reporting back, etc., it can build ownership, build transparency, and confidence amongst those who are involved. We'll hear more later from some of our other speakers around the challenges in public-private dialogue, particularly around the issue of inclusivity. How do we ensure that we're not just dealing with the people who are the existing business people who maybe are contributors to conflict or fragility, or at least who are not really interested in change, but to bring in a broader range of actors into this process and make it more participatory. So we need to look for new innovative approaches to public-private dialogue, and we can also start to think about what are the more practical models of business development. And we'll hear a little later from Maisara about social enterprises, but I'll save that for later. Janna, thank you. The other thing that we've seen in the issue of fragile and conflict-affected situations is that these aren't universally spread or equally spread across a country. We often see that there are pockets of fragility and pockets of conflict that exist across countries. There are areas that are more difficult, more fragile, more conflict affected than others. And so this often means that applying a local or a subnational approach to reform can be very relevant. It means that you can maybe begin to work and progress things further in local areas that have more peace or less conflict and some degree of more stability. And so working with the business actors and the government actors in these areas can help to build, again, confidence and build stability in those areas. Then you're often facing with two kinds of challenges. Can we replicate that? Can we repeat what's happened in one local area and transplant that to another jurisdiction or another local area? Is that possible to replicate? Or are there ways in which we can amplify that in a sort of bubble up process, whereby this has happened locally, now how can we take it to a provincial level or to a state level or to a national level? So these are often challenges, but what we've seen, I think, is a lot of examples of local subnational reforms that really do allow traction in these areas, and the challenge is then how to expand these out. Thank you, Janna. Almost finally, the other issue that comes within this is around the issue of how do we introduce reforms without doing harm? Is there a way of doing no harm at the very least in these areas? And I think what we're seeing here is that obviously the broader goal and ambition is certainly stability and cohesion and all those things I've talked about. But because we are changing the status quo, reforms will mean more competition. They will mean bringing new people and actors into the area, and this can create more insecurity at times. So we often look at where is the danger of ongoing or further conflict as a result of the potential reform. And here we know that good assessment is very important, and trying to get a sound understanding of what the root cause of the conflict or fragility are, and whether or not the proposed reform will exacerbate that in any way, and how we can possibly mitigate that. So here again, we almost circle around to the issue of when doing this kind of private sector development and business environment reform, we need to carefully understand and align this with the peacemaking and humanitarian support that's in place, so that we're working in some degree of alignment. Thanks, Jan. So, in my last slide, I just wanted to share some of the high-level issues that have come out of this work, and I'm calling it advice for reformers. And reformers, of course, are governments who are eager to make change, and because it's governments who manage the business environment, it's governments who make the changes in the business environment. They are in the driver's seat of this process. But we'll also see that there are business organizations. Business organizations are an important part of the dialogue process. They can also advocate, and they are very important in representing and engaging governments. So, and then of course, separate to that, we might also have donor and development agencies that can facilitate and support the process in the way that the ICRF is talking about. So the first thing is, how can we build trust? It might be small reforms first in some of the areas that I've talked about, the pragmatic, deal-based, very focused, or even local area reforms. How to build trust, build confidence, and get these stakeholders, ensure there's good representation. The second point is about macro level interventions, recognizing that this may not always be possible, these high levels, that it can be often more important to reflect the needs of the private sector, and where possible, align this with the government will. There usually are government frameworks and programs or policies, but they may have trouble being implemented, but these often exist, and we need to find the connections to align with those. Thirdly, this issue of conflict assessment, everybody talked about them being time-consuming and very costly. In some cases, we heard about agencies doing conflict assessments across the agencies, which were less useful than focusing on specific reform programs. So it's important to look at how the reform affects the peace and stability prospects, and whether it does in fact create a problem or a potential for igniting further conflict. And lastly, and again, I'm circling around to the initial point here, it's important to look at how we can integrate economic and business development programming with security and peacemaking. Often we see these activities are being done by different ministries in government, or different departments or units within a development agency, or whatever it might be. But it's important to draw these connections as much as possible. Everybody we spoke to and the research or the evidence that we looked at showed how those connections can be very powerful. So I think I'll stop there. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to our further discussion. Thanks, Janna.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was a great insight. I think it kind of summed up very well what you had researched, and then also made this even more tangible now to discuss it. Thank you so much for that. We would like to move into our panel discussion. I just wanted to at this moment ask the audience if you have questions already, please already feel free to post them in the question box, and we will pick them up after the panel discussion. But I'm sure you would have maybe some questions already now, so if you have them in your mind, please note them down already. And I would now like to move on to our panel discussion. You can already see our speakers here, and I will hand over to you, Simon, actually, to lead us and ask some questions, and we will hear some more insights from the Philippines and from Somalia. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Janna. Well, I think what we might do initially then is move on to the next set of slides, because Maisara is going to give us a short outline and, if you like, a case study of her work, which particularly is interested in this issue of a lot of public-private dialogue, but also around the issue of social enterprise and the value and relevance of that. So I think we'll hand over to you, Maisara.
Thank you very much, Simon, and also Janna, and of course, Rima. Thank you very much for all those who are here today listening to our discussion on reforming business environments. Thank you, ICR. The importance of public-private partnerships cannot be denied when it comes to reforms in the business environment. It is through partnerships between the public and private sector that we can change the game to make it more viable and successful. In our case, the reform which we sought is to institutionalize social enterprise, not only in our law, but in our administrative structure, as a pathway for poverty alleviation and attain peace amidst an environment of conflict and fragility. In our current business environment, several challenges have been identified. The following. Number one would be conflict and fragility. Despite its enormous untapped human and natural resources, the Bangsamoro region remains the poorest in the entire country, the Philippines, with the highest poverty index at 61.3% in 2018 and 70% in one of the province. 50 years of war between the rebel forces and the government brought untold damage, loss of lives, and long-term poverty to the people. The second barrier is our few presence of investors and funders and lack of financial capital. Limited investments from the government and the private sector is brought about by presence of criminalities, armed conflict in the Bangsamoro region that makes the business environment unfavorable, thereby limiting public and private sector investments to enter and thrive. Inadequate infrastructure, support facilities such as roads, water, electricity, and communication also cause hesitance in the part of the investors. Low access to and availability of financial services, including investment financing, such as startup capital, where the region lacks financial intermediaries to provide services to farmers, fisher folks, and small and medium enterprises. This is due to the credibility of the borrowers to pay the amount on time as required by financial institutions. Most of the businesses in the region have insufficient capital investment and cannot access financial services due to credibility requirement. The region, in fact, has the lowest density of banks in the Philippines. As of September 2018, there are only 19 banks in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region that serves roughly 4 million population. That accounts to 0.2% of the total number of banks in the country. This means that on the average, there is only 0.05 banks for every 100,000 residents in the region, as compared to a ratio of 6.6 and 12 banks in Mindanao and national level, respectively. We also experience low capacity building as our barrier. The quality of available human capital or assets such as proficiency, quality, performance, and competence has declined over the 50 years. With the exodus of local talents continues unchecked, nowadays businesses are strategically planning and positioning their internal productive resources so that they can thrive successfully in the global knowledge economy. The growing importance of knowledge as opposed to traditional factors of production is changing the very nature of economic exchange everywhere. Organizations that are able to master the production of knowledge and its conversion to tradable goods and services are topping the charts of economic growth and success. Knowledge economy is also related to human capital development, since humans are knowledge carrier. As human capital continues to be an engine for business growth, the success of companies now depends on its availability and its ability to develop, organize, and productively use its human capital resources, which we have yet to do in the Bangsamoro. With all of this, the cost of war, next slide, Janna, have brought untold misery. There are 100, since 1970 to 1996 alone, there have been 120,000 people killed. 50% are the combatants, 20% civilians, 30% soldiers. Every year, 20 billion unrealized income has been lost, or almost 640 billion pesos in economic loss due to damages to businesses and properties. Potential investments and businesses are also affected. Every year, 73 billion pesos have been used for combat alone. Almost 1 million people are displaced, and in 2000 in the all-out war, and recently 600,000 in 2008, and not including around 400,000 in the latest Marawi siege in 2017. However, there is a renewed hope in the region. The establishment of a new government as a product of peace agreement between the rebel forces and the government of the Philippines gives hope for a stable peace and order. We are now in a post-conflict era where infrastructure development, robust business sector, and good governance could transform the region from being the poorest into one of the country's pride. This is where the relevance of social enterprise model steps in. With the participation of people in the vulnerable sector as a must to find a durable solution to the people's economic problem, there is an increasing clamor from the poor and the marginalized people who compose 70% of the population to become self-reliant and not dependent on aid or charity. Thus, the government, the private sector, the civil society all came together to find an alternative solution that can create an enabling environment where the most vulnerable, the most marginalized sector can participate, and where the values of the business model is compatible with the economic, social, and cultural context of the people in the Bangsamoro region. Social enterprise then was seen as a business model that became popular. A lot of not-for-profit organizations now in the Bangsamoro transform their organization to become social enterprises. A wealth-creating organization that explicitly declares and pursues poverty reduction, alleviation, and improvement of the quality of life of specific segments of the poor as its principal objective. A lot of studies show that social enterprise have higher startup rates, they grow faster, and they create more jobs than standard businesses. How did we get there? In establishing social enterprise? A closer look at how this business model operates seems that the common goal of social enterprise is to empower marginalized sector of the community, assist people into employment, and improve the environment as well as culture. It is because of this agenda that allows the social enterprise to be accepted and flourished even in a fragile state like the Bangsamoro. More importantly, its role in influencing the policy agenda created a platform to build peace and positive communities. That's the reason why social enterprises are held to be valuable in almost all economies. It is therefore the role of institutions like the government, private sector, to create this enabling environment where the marginalized or vulnerable people can freely exercise to live the lives they value, encourage their active participation, in nation building. Thus, I would like to share with you how our office promoted advocacy for social enterprise, where we conducted 3 major projects. First would be the National Digital Campaign, Boost Your Business. This provided training for social entrepreneurs to use and leverage social media to promote their social enterprises. This was the first in the region. Second would be Social Enterprise Bootcamp. In September last year, we conducted this bootcamp where change movers underwent intensive training from experts on how to begin social enterprise or improve the current social enterprise they already have. And last but not least, the Social Enterprise Conference in November, where we conducted the largest and the first ever social enterprise conference in the Bangsamoro region, post-conflict, in partnership with the Marawi Social Enterprise, a private incorporation, which is a youth NGO, with the advocacy of promoting social enterprise. It gathered many experienced speakers from public and private sector, as well as the Islamic banking sector. What I hope you would take away from our example in the Bangsamoro region is how, when both the public and private sectors work together in cooperation and partnership, synergy is created. Those in the government have a lead role to those in the private sector. When we talk about businesses and businesses with a cause, especially when the public sector takes an active part through dialogue with the private sector, we therefore maximize the gains for everyone. For policymakers like me and legislators who realize the potential of social enterprise for poverty alleviation and peace building, we champion this advocacy in the Congress of the Philippines with the help of a network of international NGOs, civil society organizations like the PhilSen, the Moropreneur, the private sectors, and supported by the CSO SEED, or Social Enterprise Program of the EU and British Council. We were able to build coalitions, form strategic alliances in the government and the private sector, and initiate policy dialogue, which eventually led to our output to have the law in place, as well as enabling policy in the Bangsamoro. Last slide, Janna. Thus, the adoption into law of the social enterprise that put into place the institutionalization of social enterprise with the success of the private and public partnership and dialogue. Thank you very much, and I hope you've learned from our lessons on private-public partnership and dialogue on social enterprise and the success of its adoption in the Bangsamoro organic law, as well as establishing a structure for it in the administrative code. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maisara. Thank you very much. It's very interesting to get a picture of the fragility and conflict, the issues that you're facing in the region, but then also the concept of a new legal framework, a new model, business entity framework, and then what's required to get that and get that passed by the Congress. The advocacy, the training, the learning around that was useful. We'll hear from Rima now, but I think I would then want to come back and try and tease out a little bit more about that process of getting that reform going in the region and the sorts of challenges you faced and the relevance of it. But thank you very much for that introduction. I think we'll move to Rima now, who I understand is we'll be talking about Somaliland and Somalia, but is meeting us via Nairobi. So welcome, Rima. And again, we'll hand over to you to give a bit of a short presentation on the experiences that you've had in Somaliland and Somalia. And you'll need your microphone.
Thank you, Simon. I don't have a prepared presentation because I wanted to have a conversation, and I've been working on Somalia and Somaliland for the last 8 years, just to sort of talk about the difference when we talk about Somalia and Somaliland. Somaliland is a self-declared territory within the international borders of Somalia, but it has gone through a process of bottom-up state building with very little international assistance till say the 2008. So when the state of Somalia collapsed in 1991, Somaliland went through a process of bottom-up state building, and the rest of Somalia, it's really been since 2012 that we've moved to a situation where we still have peacekeepers. There's large parts of the territories which are still under the control of Al-Shabaab and so on, which is still not accessible. So it is really, when we look at the fragility index, when we talk about Somalia in that context, we have at least 7 different contexts in the country. So it is really difficult to sort of, and at different levels of fragility. So say, for example, in Somaliland, where I can walk on the street by myself, and if I'm walking by myself, the people will protect me because they want they want me to be safe. Whereas in Somalia, we still have to go with bulletproof vests and bulletproof, with armored cars and so on. But what fascinates me about my 8 years in Somalia and Somaliland is the energy of the private sector. The fact that the government has not been there. So in Somaliland, the government was built with the support of the private sector, right? But in Somalia, Somalia now functions and it's booming in terms of construction and so on, in terms of investments, in terms of entrepreneurship, is because I think the lack of regulation. So there's a space. So what I'm talking about is 2 different sets of frontier economies and how that works. So what I love about Somalia and Somaliland is the fact that the entrepreneurial spirit, particularly in terms of, say, banking, telecoms, and energy, has thrived, has really thrived, right? And before any of us had mobile banking was way well underway in Somalia or in the Somali context. But what is interesting is now is when we are, when we're talking about these frontier economies, when we try to look at regulation, say through formal processes, be it through, working through the IFC or the World Bank or whatever, it hasn't worked. And so what we're trying to find out is how do we work in this situation of informality. So I want to focus on 2 things. I want to focus one on the energy sector, and then I will talk about the EIP, which is the European Investment Plan. So on the energy sector, I was involved from 2015. Somalia and Somaliland has the cost of energy is $1 per kilowatt hour, so very expensive. This has been in terms of doing business reports. There's the 3 top constraints are access to the cost of energy, security, and land, right? Which is usually a problem in conflict situations. Land titles. And so we worked together with the Somaliland government on developing an energy law. But there was huge, so the government wants the cost of energy to come down, and the law looked at deconstructing the energy sector so that there was separation. But right at the very last minute, the energy service providers, the ESPs, they took out those critical provisions about the cost of energy and the structure of the energy sector, so that we still have the high, one of the highest rates of highest cost of energy. What it boils down to is the fear of the unknown. what we were trying to talk to them and say was, look, if you bring the cost of energy down, we can, we can have private sector development. We can, so you have a bigger customer base, and it's one of those kind of frustrating stories, but it's one of those stories that will have to continue to go on. It's about that negotiated process of PPD, public-private dialogue, and particularly in contexts, such as Somaliland and Somalia. So that is like I think what I'm trying to say is the limits of hybridity and the fear of formality, right? So that is one. So, and then, so the current program that I'm working on is over 100 million euros, and it's across doing a range of programs across Somalia, starting from stabilization through to setting up an investment facility, microfinance facility, resilient value chains, youth entrepreneurship, and then social protection. And trying to figure out how, in this very complex situation, how can all those different interventions reinforce each other? And so as part of that process, we had a European Investment Plan meeting. And what was really interesting was, I mean, Europe's policy is, we need to sort of invest in places like Somalia because we don't want more. It's an immigration issue, and it's a strategic issue. But what was really interesting for me when we had that EIP dialogue was there were the European DFIs, the direct foreign investment, the development banks, talking and presenting and unsure about how to engage, and then the private sector talking about the risks and all the issues that they had to deal with, but neither of them being able to really talk to, knowing what to do. So what we're doing is the next stage is, how do we take the next step in terms of getting direct foreign investment in the Somali context? So I think, I've sort of given you two bits to deal with. I mean, there's also, we have the usual problem with, because it's the triad of the banks, the telcos, and the energy being the same owners. There is a kind of like a monopoly of access to finance, and in the Somali context, women cannot get access to finance because they need to provide a proof of assets, and that's not possible. And so I've talked about many different things, but it's inspiring but frustrating. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you very much, Rima. Rima and I met in Hargeisa maybe 3 or 4 years ago now, and it's really great to hear the examples of the issues that you've been facing in Somaliland, Rima, and thanks very much. I want to just, I think, make a connection between some interesting points that I think have come through so far. The first is both the examples of Maisara has given is, of course, not coming from the Philippines, but it's coming from the Bang's more autonomous territory of that. So it's, of course, a subnational area in which there has been conflict, and the response to this is to be able to create this reforms that are very much focused on this local area. Rima's talked about a state in Somaliland, in Somalia, and as Somaliland is a different pocket of opportunity for reform compared to Somalia. And Rima, you've talked about the private sector driving stability in Somaliland because there is the presence of a private sector, whereas in broader Somalia, that's not always the case. And so I think what's interesting to me is we are seeing two examples here of subnational reforms that are very much tailored around what's been going on within a particular territory. I think we've also heard very interesting examples of that. Yeah, there are major issues in both these examples of conflict and violence. And I mentioned before the difference of working in and on conflict. That there are both those issues are at play, I think, in both the examples you've given. And Rima talked, I really love this idea of the transition from a frontier economy to a regulatory economy. And that's a difficult transition, and it's one that, of course, takes a long period of time, I'm sure. But again, I think both examples give us some illustrations of that. I think Rima's given us the example of how that affects in terms of breaking up monopolies, or not even monopolies, which are somewhat extreme sometimes, but just creating, introducing rules, introducing competition, introducing more inclusive things. And I hope we can talk a bit more about that in a moment. Whereas Maisara has given us examples again of that transition from frontier to more regulated, where it's more community driven, but a legal framework of social enterprise was required to get there. And I'm sure, to me, that's particularly interesting. And I suppose, Maisara, I'd like to come to you with the first question around this as we move forward into our discussion, and for everyone into our Q&A. But Maisara, I wonder whether you can just explain to us why it was important to, you've talked about the advantage of social enterprise, but I'm not sure I fully understand why social enterprise is so important in the autonomous territory. Isn't that what people are doing anyway? Why has it been important to get this legislation through?
We need the legislation so that the social enterprise can be supported by the government through access to capital, training or capacity building, and also in the economic and peace building initiatives of the Bangsamoro subnational government. SE or social enterprise had been a viable option. Since the Bangsamoro is predominantly a Muslim population, it is logical to see a business model that is akin to Islamic concept on economic empowerment, specifically on entrepreneurship. The basic concept of entrepreneurship in Islam stands on a mutual relationship, partnership, and participation, altruism, and goodwill. Its concept is grounded on the objectives on unity or tawheed, trusteeship, khilafah, and worship, ibadah, which will be implemented for social justice and public interest. Hence, we see that social enterprise is a very viable business model in our region, which is mainly akin to what we have as a predominantly Muslim population in the Bangsamoro.
So again, then this is an example of you're sort of through this process, you're formalizing a social norm, an understood cultural way of behaving. And it sounds, but you had to get that change through the National Congress. Is that correct?
Yes, we have to embed the social enterprise business model in the National Congress so that the awareness would be more deep in depth, have more depth, and would have more government support and funding. Because if social enterprise would just be left to the community without any access to capital provided by the government, I don't think it can take off. We take off from the Grameen business model in Pakistan also, where the micro entrepreneurs are provided capital. But this time we want this business model to be supported by the government and driven by the government until such time that the small entrepreneurs will be able to stand on their own, just like in Scotland, where they are the world's #1 in terms of social enterprise. And I believe that through social procurement, this small social enterprise, which is have more sustainable way of doing business in terms of protecting the environment, are the source and go-to of the government of Scotland, and they are now utilizing this small enterprise to supply their needs in the Scottish government. And we also want that in the Bangsamoro, because small entrepreneurs like mothers, women, persons with disability or differently abled people who have the potential to do business through micro or small enterprises can participate in this business model. And when we have those kinds of self-reliant model where small vulnerable groups of population and marginalized people can participate, we can have more durable and sustainable peace in the Bangsamoro. So that's our actually that's the reasoning behind why we want the government to take the lead role in promoting, establishing, funding social enterprise as well as the private sector also initiative.
Yeah. I mean, I'm interested in how you were able to advocate and of course, get that success in the National Congress.
So,
but also, if I could just quickly, I wanted to ask though, often people will say it's the implementation that's the real challenge. So now that you have this passed, how do you implement this in the Bangsamoro autonomous region? You know, if you are facing these challenges of fragility and conflict, especially in the government structures, how does implementation of this then work?
The implementation is quite challenging, but I believe that when it's a community-driven business, the people will protect it. And the fragility aspect of it, like those who are vulnerable to joining private armies, will now have an alternative option not to do that because they will now have access to capital. The government can support them on a particular business idea that they can have, like incubation groups, like what we are doing right now. The government can provide them the financial literacy and financial management skills. So potential young people who are vulnerable to being violent extremists can now have an alternative viable economic option to participate in building their economy through this business model, because the government will be able to support them through access to finance and as well as training and capacity building. And that is embedded in the law as a pathway for peace and development in the region. The reason why it was supported by the Congress of the Philippines is because the private sector came on board and really argued for and in behalf of social enterprise, because we see that this business model is the future, because it protects the environment, the culture, as well as it's social mission driven. So in a highly conflict area, what we need really is people caring for each other. So I think this business model is embraced by many in the community, especially the most marginalized and vulnerable. So implementation-wise, it should really be the government who should make sure to start the ball rolling with the support of the private business investment. When they see the potential of the business, I don't think they would not get on board when they see some real proof of what do you call it, concept. So
Yeah.
those are some challenges.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Simon, if I might just,
sorry.
If I might just follow up on what Maisara just said, what is really interesting is so that the program that I'm currently working on, and the EU has, I don't speak on behalf of the EU, but I want to talk about the program, is how they're trying to, there's three result areas. One is stabilization, one is economic development, and one is social protection. And what is really interesting is like the government, all the governments, all the different governments have rejected a continued humanitarian approach and want to link it to a livelihoods approach, particularly when it comes to the social protection component, right? So this is where I talked about where the result area 2, which has the investment facility, the microfinance facility, the youth entrepreneurship, the resilient value chains. We're really trying to find ways of linking result area 3, which is social protection, with those components to really graduate people out from the most bottom, the bottom of the pyramid up to the next level. And this is through entrepreneurship, this is through coaching, this is through mentorship, all the things that you just talked about, Maisara. Sorry, Simon, I interviewed you.
In fact, in a little while, we're going to move to our Q&A session, and I'll turn to Janna for that. But Rima, I wanted to follow up on that, because you just, in this transition from the frontier to the regulatory economy, which, as I said, I really liked, you talked about the problems of monopolies. And I think, sometimes that's an extreme way of looking at it. But we often know that there are people who have been in business for a long time. They're usually the businessmen, the older businessmen who have been around for a long time, and they sit around the nice boardroom tables, and often the public-private dialogue and engagement is very much limited to them. Somalia has a youth bulge, young people majority. There are many women involved in business, whether both in the formal but particularly in the informal. I think what you're talking about as well is a more inclusive process. And how do you get that to happen?
I mean, it's a process where, particularly, one, we have, when I'm talking Somalia broadly now, I mean, we have security concerns, we have, we have the issue of clan is very prominent and so on. So it is very challenging. It is very challenging to have these inclusive processes. And not the project that I'm working on now, but what project that the company that I'm working for is implementing. It's like a 130 million project, which is the Somalia Stability Fund, funded by a range of donors like the EU, FDCO, UK FDCO, a whole range of donors, where they have used private sector development, particularly looking at enterprises supported by women and youth, as a means for promoting stability. And it is, unfortunately, where we normally have these very formal processes where we have the usual suspects coming to those meetings. We actually have to go down to communities and really break down. Actually, part of those formal processes are part of the structures, that limit inclusion. So we have to find innovative ways in these very challenging circumstances to get people to have voice. And it's a very targeted approach.
Yes.
Maybe opening up basically, because this is a perfect moment to jump to some of the questions that we have from the audience. Thanks so much thus far from both of you or all of you. We have actually many questions, and this is why I would like to turn to them. And I'm trying to get them together a little bit. So the next question is basically three in one. And maybe Rima, firstly to you, but I think both of you could answer this. We have been talking a lot about inclusive PPDs, or business environment reforming, to bring as many groups or as many people as possible, representative groups as possible to one table. And we had the question on how can we really include also vulnerable groups? And I think you touched upon this just now in your answer. But then we also had the question how we could even include people that are more not legitimate power brokers in a country like Somalia. I guess you were just saying this is very prevalent, and so how can we even maybe include them, or how do you deal with that in your PPD situations? And then also, who decides? And I think this is very much connected with that. Who decides who sits on the table when we talk about PPDs in such contexts?
Thank you. I mean, these are all things that I have to, that we grapple with every day, right? I mean, in the Somali context, we have IDPs, we have refugees returning from and Somalia has one of the highest rates of urbanization in the world. And these are real problems that the international community, the Somali government, and the communities themselves are trying to deal with. And like in many other contexts, so say for example, if we were talking about the most vulnerable, so if we're talking about the most vulnerable, it would be minority groups, it would be IDPs, it would be returnees, refugees. And what we found, and this is not in this project, but other projects that we've done, is that in the IDP camps, right, there are gatekeepers who really control access, movement in and out, or any sort of activity. And in the Somali context, these IDP camps are no longer IDP camps. They're no longer internally displaced people. They're now the urban poor, right? And so it's really interesting about how the international community also deals with these sorts of communities, where, you know, and I said before, where the government has said, we don't want the humanitarian approach anymore. You know, we don't want handouts anymore. We want resilience, we want livelihoods, and we need to do this differently. So this is what the government is saying to us. But at the same time, we have these little ecosystems, and how we've managed in other programs to try and get around these ecosystems is to go back to what Maisara said, is to get the people from the camps together, and particularly actually women and youth together, and to have voice, to give them the platform to have voice where they didn't have that platform before. So, I mean, I think it's sort of like the international community has their formal structures, and has its limitations, but we have to like do it very differently. Over to you.
Thank you.
Oh, for
Maisara,
the experience,
would you like to answer?
yes.
Go
Yes,
ahead.
for our experience, it is community-led, who wants to really change the status quo. They're already fed up with war, poverty, instability, insecurity, deaths. Recently with the Marawi siege, we witnessed the atrocities of war in this modern day and age. The mothers and the young people, they all wanted change in the society. So in that clamor for change, the government was responsive and heard that clamor for change. So much so that asked me as a representative of the people to the government, ask also the government that we heed the call of our people on the ground. Otherwise, there will never be peace in our land. So what we did with the support, as I've said, of the international organization, just like the EU, the British Council, the Philippine PhilSen, or the Philippine Social Enterprise Network, the Moropreneur, a local-based civil society organization, and all other local advocacy groups gathered together and convinced the national government to put that framework, which was the clamor of the people, into the law. And then it was adopted by the government when we put on the argument that the people wants to have an economy that is based on their own way of life, meaning they are the ones who will control how the business will look like. They want to have a framework that is more akin to their values, their social and cultural context. And they just need the help and the push of the government to start this change to happen. And so when it was argued before the senators and the congressmen, they were convinced, and indeed they said, let's put that into the law, let's put a framework, and let's give it to them. That's the reason why when this law was passed, many of the people on the ground participated in the Congress. You see, the first conference, it was participated by so many social entrepreneurs in the Marawi city where the Marawi siege happened. And you know, at first Facebook was hesitant to go there in Marawi. They said, oh no, we're probably going to experience insecurity. But no, the people themselves protected the Facebook people to really hold that event. Meaning it's the people who wanted to change. So they will protect and secure private sector investments, private sector support when they come in. So if it's the people deciding what they want to do, there really will be a change in the society. So I really believe in that power of the people to pursue that change. That's the reason why the government people like me should hear them and respond to what they need and put that framework, fund that framework, implement that framework, and monitor and evaluate that framework. And then the virtuous cycle that Simon has said a while ago would probably happen when we do that. You know, more success breeding success when we do that. That's the reason why right now it was just adopted last November. So it's very young, November 5. So we need to get the ball rolling. And then they said the evidence or the taste of the pudding is in the eating, right? So we will see in the days to come when the rubber meets the road in the implementation. But the important thing is that the government, the private sector, the civil society, the marginalized people, the vulnerable sector, all came into an agreement that we want changes, and the vehicle for that change is social enterprise.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Thanks to you both. Also, I have a lot of follow-up questions to you, and I'm trying to sort them a bit. Maybe to both of you, maybe you can answer this quite quickly. I hope then we can move on to the next one. There was a question on how long these, or a person said that these public-private dialogues, they take very, very long because people will have to get together, they have to start talking to each other. It's a long process. And so this person said, first of all, to you, Rima, how did you deal with your project? You know, in your project, how do you deal with the fact that you're there for just a short while, maybe with a certain project time, but of course the PPD will be going on and on and on. So how do you deal with that? Because of course there should be probably a certain ownership also from the people there to keep going with that. So maybe just quickly, if you can say something.
Just quickly, I think, I mean, what I was fortunate enough to do in the instance of, say, the energy, the PPDs on energy, right? One of the strategies was to have a roadmap, which was very clear. And then within the international community and the government and the private sector, what we managed to do is do a division of labor, right? Going, okay, so World Bank will do this, EU will do this, UK FCDO will do this, and so there was like so it's required. It was in that particular instance, it required continued dialogue, but a strong leadership from the government and strong leadership from the donors to push the agenda forward, right? And that project started at it's the award-winning project that I was telling you about. But the law has still not passed since, that was, I think we've tried to get the law through in 2015. So there's still the need for the PPD to happen. But we just what we tried to do is bring the international community together to have one voice and have a more coordinated effort to work with the government and with the private sector. So, and yes, it's a long-term process and it's ongoing. Thank you.
And Maisara, maybe turning to you, I have another question directly to the context of the Philippines. And it says, how would the Philippines harmonize state policies and laws and regulation with soft and social regulations. If the state is not directly involved in regulation, who is held accountable for inadequate policy, law, incentives, compliance? I think this is touching upon the fact that you said it's very much community driven, I think, right?
With regards to the framework, it is the government who sets that social enterprise or business that is socially driven, and they reinvest part of their profits in the business. And that business is about environment, culture, and there's another one, aside from economy, of course, 4 bottom lines: peace, planet, profit, and people. So those are the 4 bottom lines. So it's the government. The government is not really a regulatory frame that does not provide a regulatory framework, but provides a technical and financial framework where the government can provide an enabling environment in which the condition for this social enterprise can grow. So the framework that we put in is not really purely regulatory. It's not regulatory. In fact, it is more of a growing the social enterprise, supporting the growth of social enterprise. Because if the government steps in to regulate, then that might be a disincentive to growing the social enterprise. Because businesses should have a certain amount of laissez-faire has to be given. They have to be given freedom to grow their businesses. Too much regulation can kill actual businesses. So what we do just provide the technical framework, the financial support that we can provide to the small scale or micro entrepreneur social enterprises, and not really put so much regulation because it's in the inception stage still. So we could not step in to regulate.
Janna, if I might just quickly pick up what Maisara says, is it's again that tension between frontier and formality, right? The transition between frontier and formality, and we just come across this time and time again in the Somali context, be it in the telecoms, trying to regulate the telecom industry or the banking industry, or just to give an example in terms of the banking industry, because of the fears of illicit financing. I can't remember the percentages of the GDP percentages anymore, but there's a huge dependence at a household level on remittances from people living overseas, right? And when the international community tried to regulate that sector and no more money was allowed to come, it was creating a humanitarian crisis, and the international community had to look at their faces and revisit it. And it's one of those difficult, what's the word? It's one of those difficult situations where we know there's illicit financing, but if we stop financing at all, then there's a bigger problem. So it's a wicked problem. So what we face in these situations, I think, are a series of wicked problems.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that is said well. Yes. Maybe we have 2 more minutes until I will have to end the Q&A session. But there's one last question also to you, Simon, and to your input. And I allow you to have the last word on the panel, and then turn maybe to Maisara and Rima for one last sentence also. So the question was, you said in your input that one should refrain from macro reforms while highlighting the importance of PPD. And the question was, in this person who was asking, in his experience, PPD often deals with questions that need to be solved on the macro level, like reforms on regulations or tax issues. And do you say that PPD should concentrate on more pragmatic short-term issues than on such important macro reforms? And maybe also linking to what we've heard now from Maisara and Rima.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, what I hoped I was trying to say was that I think the issue about macro reforms can be very important, and depending on how they are framed. What I was trying to say is these generalized macro things that often, for example, might be picked up by the doing business assessments in these things are not always immediately relevant in that sense. And what I was trying to say is that I think the focus needs to be on the more pragmatic issues that business face. Often, and I think as I understand the various contributions to today, we see that you often see formalized, presidential PPD driven mechanisms, which will bring in the captains of industry, which will talk about the macro issues. And I'm not saying that's not important necessarily, but what I'm saying is often because of situations of fragility and conflict, those things will take a very long time. And I think the Somalia example is a good one for me, because a lot of those issues, those mechanisms are there, and a lot of those large-scale issues are still underway and taking a substantial period of time to move through the system. Well, what I'm trying to give more attention to is a more inclusive model of PPD, which deals with some of the very pragmatic issues, whether it's, and again, Rima has given some examples about this of, it could simply be about, security, street lighting, safety, policing, some local level licensing, and some of these of course, energy, which could be seen as a macro issue, is also important. But I'm trying to say that what I think has come through is more and more is this more practical, pragmatic, I think, and opportunistic, I think is the terms that I used. If I can steal from what Maisara and Rima said just earlier, I really liked Maisara's talk about this clamor for change, that people are sick of violence and conflict and insecurity and fragility. But what Rima said is moving forward has uncertainty. People are unsure what that's going to bring. And so there's a step-by-step approach that people can be brought through. And I think this is a constant movement, but it is step-by-step. Again, it's not just about, I think it's easy to talk about the incumbents and the monopolies and those people who are benefiting sometimes from this. And like, we haven't talked about corruption, but you could throw corruption in there as well. But I think the inclusive agenda is a much broader agenda than that. And it's about trying to get a voice, as people have said. And again, Maisara is providing all the quotes tonight, and it's not surprising that it's a Filipino who talks about the power for the people. But the idea of driving this process through giving people a voice, I think, is really important. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. And because we're really running out of time, I would turn to Maisara and Maisara first, and then Rima, maybe to just like a highlight for you today, and a final sentence to today, and then we move on.
I really love the concept of pragmatism and opportunistic reforms and deals-based reforms, and which sequence to do in conflict-affected societies or communities. As Simon has said, we need to put street lights, we need to provide more peace and order mechanisms, we need to have banks in operation. We need to, the little things that sometimes are overlooked are the most important for businesses to thrive. And I believe that this practical things must be in place first, because it's those services that are needed by the people for them to transact ordinary businesses in their day-to-day lives. So in my takeaway in this webinar and in this ICR facilitated webinar, I believe that I've learned, and I will take it to heart, the lessons learned here, that we have to take things in sequence. First, do the little things first before you go into the macro big deals, like going into energy development, going into captains of the industry. Go to your community. What do they need? They don't have street lights, they don't have security, they don't have paved roads, they don't have transportation. Fix those first, and then invite the business later. Or better yet, it can go hand in hand together. So I think that that's the best lesson I've learned tonight in this very important webinar for me and the Philippines, and also as well as the Somalia experience, the new frontier that they have been doing, and the different layers of opportunity that they're looking into is also worth considering for the Philippines, especially for the Bangsamoro region.
Thank you, Maisara. I think the key takeaway from working in these situations is never easy. It's challenging, it's frustrating, but what I do know after 8 years, I still remain inspired. And the people who inspire me in the Somali context are the women and the young people. And this is where we need to invest, and we need to have like a multi-layered approach, not a unilateral approach, but a multi-layered approach where we have the formal discussions, but we also reach through. And one of the messages that I can say from the young people in Somalia, as you said, Maisara, is that they're fed up of the violence, the level of violence. They're fed up of having to pick up pieces of bodies, after IED attacks and so on. So it's the young people and the women that we need to sort of keep working with. Over to you.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm really running out of time because I will really listen to you, but I'm handing over to Susanne, and please, everybody who's on the line, stay on the line because this is super interesting for you. Go ahead, yes. Susanne.
Thank you. So as mentioned in the beginning of the session, as the ICR facility, we also provide short-term support related to the specific topic of business environment reform and amid conflict and fragility. So if you have a question specific for your organization, which came up during the webinar, and that you want to discuss in more detail, please contact us. We can set up an individual one-on-one session with Simon, who will be happy to support you on behalf of the ICR facility. And to register your interest, simply write us an email. You can see the email on the slide. It's icrfacility@giz.de. And please name your organization and the specific questions that you want to ask, and then we will get in touch with you. The slots, they are granted based on availability, but we can see what we can make possible. And another important thing, this offers only for public and private organizations in the ACP. Yeah, we are looking forward to hearing from you, and thank you very much.
There are the questions, Rima. Well, I'm closing with many thanks to our speakers, Simon White, Maisara Dandamun-Latiph, and Rima das Pradhan-Blach. And thank you so much for your inputs today. It was a pleasure to have you here. I also would like to thank again the donors that have contributed to this session, and you can see on the right hand side above. And if you want to learn more, we have some links provided to you here and our contact details. And please stay for a last question for your satisfactory of this webinar. We would love to hear your opinion. And with that, I'm closing. Thank you very much for everyone, and have a good evening.